Hi, Ryan. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Look, I'm really interested in getting your perspective on strength and conditioning with Masters athletes, but I thought first off, you could maybe let us know how you got into being a strength and conditioning coach.
Yeah, sure. So when I sort of finished high school, I was really into tennis, and my tennis coach actually offered me a job to start working as a tennis coach, and really enjoyed that more than I thought that I would, and sort of continued that for about 10 odd years. And in that process, I was studying a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in exercise science, master's degree being in specifically strength and conditioning. I always had an interest in it, and the pathway which I wanted to get into strength and conditioning kind of took a little bit longer than I thought, mainly because I really enjoyed the tennis coaching a lot more. But that gave me a really good grounding for all the coaching methodologies and teaching mechanisms and things like that, because I was just coaching such a wide range of young to older athletes on the court, and tennis being such a complicated motor skill sport, really challenged me to find different ways to get different elements and aspects out of my athletes. And then, I was always interested in the gym. I was competing in powerlifting for a little bit as a bit of a hobby. So always interested in that sort of stuff, but never quite took the full plunge into going into S&C until I got to a point where my studies led me to that and needed to sort of pull back on tennis coaching and get involved with some S&C work. So did the stepping stone of doing some personal training just with some Gen Pop people. This was probably midway through my studies, and then as started to get more experience through my studies and then just with training people in general, started to look for more specific facilities that would be coaching and training athletes, which led me to where I'm currently now at MFP, at Melbourne Fitness and Performance. So we're a semi-private facility which specialises in athletes' performance, and been there now for, I'd probably say coming up to 4 years at the specific gym. And just now specialise a lot with tennis, mainly because it's a sport of my passion, but also have a wide variety of sports, including swimming, footy, soccer, cricket, a few others in between there.
Yeah. And the high performance athletes you work with at the gym, what kind of structure do you follow with them? Do you work with their tennis coach, for instance, or do you sort of work independently of that and look at what they need when they come into you each week?
It's a good question, because it kind of has to have a bit of both. So from a high performance perspective, when we've got a high level athlete, if they're a bit older, so say they're in between that 16 to early 20s, they start to get a bit of independence themselves. So they can kind of tell you, hey, this is kind of what I need. Tennis coach has mentioned a few of these things. But everybody's different. Every athlete is different. Every athlete has areas they need to work on. Someone can work on something that the other one is really fine-tuned in. So it kind of depends on where they are in their development and their training age. In terms of what my philosophy is, I try to give them what they're not getting. Right. So a lot of the times if we use tennis as a specific sport, they're going to get heaps of repeat ball drills, feeding, point play, all this stuff. And a lot of their coaches will use medicine balls to rotate through their shots to kind of give them their quote unquote strength through their training. So when they come into the gym, I already know that they're getting heaps and heaps of that. So I've got to now find my entry point in their programming to what they're not getting, where their energy is leaking in movements, where their strength is lacking, to support their movement, because ultimately we want them to be moving well, hitting well, fast, powerful. So we've got to just try and find those gaps and fill them. And then once we set a really nice foundation and we've worked out where things are missing, we can start to, or continue to, work on their strengths too. So if I've got a naturally elastic, explosive athlete, I'm going to want to continue to work on those attributes, because that's where they're their strengths are. That's where they're going to actually succeed most on the court or in their sport, while still working on a few of their weaknesses so that we can raise their ceiling higher as they start to progress through their training.
Yeah. How often would you see a high performance athlete each week, or how many sessions would they do with you?
This would be sports specific, I think. I honestly believe that once a week is not enough. A lot of athletes or coaches, sports specific coaches, might disagree with that because they want as much time with their athlete as possible. So being a coach ourselves in our area, we want as much time with our athletes as possible. So we've got to try and find that middle ground somewhere, which can be quite challenging. But I'd say you'd at least need a minimum of 2 to 3 sessions, whether that's 2 gym sessions and 1 field session, or whether it's 1 gym, 1 field, or whatever your exposure points are. Definitely once a week is not enough. And it's something that you have to try educate a lot of young athletes coming in and their parents as well early on, because they honestly don't value some of this stuff as highly as they should. And once they do start to see the benefits and the buy-in to this stuff, then you can start to really push the boundary a little bit more and integrate it a little bit more with their on-court or field training. So you might have them doing their 2-hour on-court session with their coach, but then you might give them a half an hour speed session at the end or a running session at the end. So they're still getting some S&C, quote unquote S&C, but they're still have done their sport-specific training beforehand. So there's some integration there where you can kind of sneak it in. But yeah, definitely would want them at least 2 to 3 times a week, because it's too hard to really zone in on one day and try and get all the training or the attributes in there that you want or need.
Yes. And if you're looking at a sport like swimming, what sort of specific strength and conditioning exercises would you be looking at for a swimmer that can then translate into movement in the water? So someone just coming to you at the start, what would you be looking at?
Yeah, so this is a funny one, because sport, the continuum of sports specificity in the gym is quite a hot topic, probably for the last 5 to 10 years, is how specific are our exercises to the sport that they're playing. And it comes back to that question of what are they not getting? So am I giving them the same things that they're going to be getting in the pool? So if they're going in the pool and they're doing their laps and doing their things, and then the coach jumps in and says, hey, we need to work on your stroke production here to get you more efficient through the water. And then they're going to do some drilling based on that. And then I come into the gym and I go, okay, here's a resistance band, pull it down from your shoulder height and whatever. But they've kind of already just done that for the whole week. Then I'm doubling up and not really giving them what they need, and trying to fill in the gaps that's causing them to not swim efficiently or perform at their best. So specificity is a tricky one, because we need to figure out why they need it to be so specific. So for example, if let's say it's their shoulder strength that is causing some energy leakage in their swimming stroke and they can't produce it as efficiently, it may not necessarily be the specific movement that's causing the issue. It could be the fact that their shoulders or their lats or their rotator cuff or whatever muscle is weak. So we have to actually work to strengthen it. So I might not necessarily go in and do a specific swimming movement in the gym. I might do a lot of I might do pull-ups, I might do shoulder presses, internal, external rotation exercises, even some circumduction exercises, which is rotating the arm internally and externally. I would probably do a lot more of that first. Make sure those structures are strong and they can handle the load compared to their body weight, compared to their strength levels as a whole, once we've kind of done their initial assessments and things. Then once I see they can handle the loads of the gym and what they're required to do from a basic strength standpoint, then we can hone in and get more specific. How specific? I probably wouldn't be replicating the swimming strokes in the gym, but I would be trying to use similar movement patterns. So for example, if we're just talking freestyle, where they'd be going sort of overhead and rotating their shoulder all the way through, I might be doing heaps of pull-ups.
Yeah.
So a pull-up is a great overhead movement. It's a great shoulder strength. It recruits all the shoulder muscles that are in and around it and the supporting groups as well. And then as an accessory exercise, I might then get them to do something specific like a straight arm lat pull down or a single arm tricep kickback or something like that. That's quite similar to the movement, but not exactly replicating it, because ultimately doing some of those movements under load are going to be really demanding on the joints and then probably have the counter effect of what we're actually trying to do and injure them.
Yes.
Just using those exercises as examples. I mean, there's heaps and heaps of others that we can use, but I would say for the most point, it would follow the general strength and conditioning principles of starting general, create strength adaptations, get them strong, get them robust, make sure the joints, the integrity of the joints are there, the mobility is there, all that sort of stuff, and then start to directly go more specific. And that also will come into play in terms of their competition phases too. So the closer you get to competition, the more specific you're going to get, because you're going to ease off on the heavier strength as well, which opens up another rabbit hole that we can go down. But for the most part, you would be trying to go specific. I say in summary, you're probably going more specific the closer you get to a competition and the more you see that the athlete can handle it.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about competition, taking it right through to then. So would you recommend still continuing your sessions but pulling back a little bit during that competition, say you were racing on the weekend as an athlete, as a swimmer, and then would you lay off your strength and conditioning sessions in that week, or would you do them at a much lighter level?
I definitely wouldn't. Again, it comes down to the frequency of competition. So if you've just got one competition and then you're going to go straight back into training afterwards, and if it's a lower level comp, I'd probably continue training up until, and like you said, you'd either ease off the load a little bit and go a little bit lighter, or ease off the volume so you can keep similar loads, but not as much volume, so that the muscles aren't pulling up as fatigued. You're giving them an easier time to recover. And there's other ways you can do it as well. You can really trick the body. You can do similar movements but decrease the range of motion, so you're not going through as deeper ranges of motions through the joints and the muscles, so it's less demanding, but still similar movements to what you've been doing in the program leading up to it. There's different ways, and then it comes down to importance of the competition. So if it's a national level competition that you're trying to qualify for, or whatever it may be, you might need to look at peaking methods that are going to help you peak physically for these comps. So that the deload that you're going to do in the lead up might look a little bit different to say if it was just a club comp or weekly club comp or the state comp that may not be as high level of importance.
Yes.
I think as well, when you're looking at the specifying with competitions, when you're looking at your calendars, if you do have heaps of club comps throughout the year and you're always wanting to deload and not train or completely take off gym training prior to every time you have a club comp, you're missing out on a heap of training that you probably don't need to miss out on. Which is why you can kind of get around it by doing things like lowering the volume or stop training on the Wednesday before the comp on Saturday. Whatever kind of works well with your body. And everybody, again, like I've mentioned before, everyone's a bit different. It comes down to the individual. So you might need lower volume, and then the person, in lane 8 might need more volume but less load, depending on how their body responds. And that just comes down to how well the coach knows the athlete, as well as how much they've been tracking their performance when it comes down to competitions.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting. I was reading an article about the NBA basketballers. So LeBron James, for instance, actually does a weight session before his match every single day. It's a very different mindset to, I think, what a lot of swimmers have, where you said earlier, they're trying to squeeze their strength and conditioning sessions sort of in amongst their swimming? Because typically there's been a lot of sessions for swimmers in a week, for instance. Yeah.
Well, you're 100% right, and it comes down to routine as well. Like someone like LeBron, who's just a freak athlete, and you can't those type of athletes come along, once every, well, more often now, but once every 5-10 years you get a LeBron. So for someone like him, he's just going to do what he always does. He still trains hard, still works hard. Don't take anything away from that, but he's going to use those. You probably will never find out what happens in those weight sessions, but you can imagine that it's not too heavy. It's just something he always does to go out and get his mindset right and get focused before a match. From a scientific perspective, there is the concept of priming and potentiating the nervous system so that it's fired up and ready to go before you go out and play. Again, that becomes sport specific. For example, 100-meter sprinter, that'd almost be recommended to go and lift some heavy weight before going out and doing their sprint so that they can prime their nervous system. Whereas, say, a swimmer or a marathon runner, a bit more endurance-based, might not work that well for them. You mentioned before about, trying to intersperse all your training because there's so many sessions. That, again, it's tricky, especially, for a lot of, when you're talking elite level, if it's their job, they've got time to do a swimming session in the morning and a gym training session in the afternoon.
Yeah.
But for the majority of the population who are competing at a high level, they've got to work. So they don't necessarily have that ability to do both in one day. So you do have to prioritize. And a lot of the time the sport does get a priority over it, and which does make sense. However, if we're talking about improving peak performance and longevity within the sport, there has to be some priority shift towards your strength and conditioning and your athletic performance stuff that you do in the gym.
Absolutely. I mean, I know you train a lot of high performance athletes. What's the difference with training those type of athletes as opposed to an older, mature sort of masters athlete? What's the main difference that you see?
Not much. So you still apply your same principles. The only difference is, and when you say high performance, I wouldn't necessarily argue that a masters athlete is not high performance. Yep. If we're talking, say, younger elite athletes, I think the difference that we've got there is the physiological differences that we naturally would have at a younger age. What we do know is that male and females generally, females peak a little bit earlier than males. So females around that 25 to 28-year-old mark, and then males a little bit later around that 28-year-old mark. But we're starting to see a bit of a shift in that as well. A lot of athletes are staying in their sports longer now as we understand more about how our bodies function and proper periodization within training.
Yep.
But just because we've gone through that peak and then after that, you have that really slow decline, it is very slow. So it's not like all of a sudden you turn 30 or 35 and all of a sudden your body deteriorates. You still have the ability to train. It just becomes, the management side of things become a little more of a priority. So, all your little 1%ers that you would need to take a bit more of a focus in sleep, nutrition, breath work, mindset, all that sort of stuff is going to impact on your ability to recover from your competition and your training, so that you can then perform again a couple of days later or whenever you need to. But all the general things that you would apply to a younger elite athlete apply to junior athletes and apply to masters athletes. It's just a matter of managing the other little things. So things like specificity. I'm not necessarily going to then say junior athlete, I'm going to work a lot on fundamental movement patterns, teaching them pretty much everything they're going to need to know as they progress their journey and their development. Whereas, say, a masters athlete, I'm going to just get into the specifics on what I need them to do. Now, specifics here I'm referring to is not specificity of the sport in the gym. It's more the specifics of the adaptations I'm trying to create from a physical level. So, for example, if we're talking as a swimmer, and they need to be explosive out the blocks because that's where they're slow. I'm going to work on that attribute specifically. I'm not going to spend my time in trying to develop the different stages of this athlete. I'm going to try and attack that adaptation a bit sooner.
Yes.
Then the other things you just got to be prepared to do is that adaptations may take a little bit longer to come than a younger athlete, which we can assume. So you just got to be prepared that we might need a little bit longer to see those results. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's not going to happen. It just depends on the age, but it just will take a little bit longer.
Yep.
And the other things would probably be intensity. We definitely need intensity in the training to get the adaptation. I think the common misconception there is I'm going to put less intensity into my training because I want to be careful of the athlete. I want to make sure that they don't injure themselves or hurt themselves with their joints, but you're not going to get anything out of their training if you just continually applying sub-max principles to it, and then there's no stimulus that the athlete's going to then adapt to. So I think that, there definitely needs to be intensity, but I think also because of the longer recovery periods that you're going to need, the intensity needs to be used a bit more sparingly. But having said that, it's not like you go 1 intense session and then you can't do it for 5 days. It's more across the week instead of doing 6 high intensity days where there's heavy loads, a lot of power training, big demands on the nervous system. You might bring that frequency down just a little bit and then periodize it a little more over the course of a few more weeks rather than trying to get it in like a 3-week block.
Yes.
And then the other part will be mobility and flexibility. I think as we get older, our joints and muscles need more attention. So we need to make sure that our body is staying or maintaining that flexibility and mobility that it once had when we were younger. And if we continue to do that, just ride through. So if you just keep that as part of your protocols and you, on your off days, you're doing your work, you're doing your mobility, it's not that hard to do. It's just people can get lazy with it. And sitting in front of the TV watching Netflix, just do it. You just do it for your half an hour, whatever you need to, and then you maintain those ranges of motion and the flexibility within the muscles to allow you to complete the training that you want to complete.
Yeah.
Other than that, periodization, progressive overload, all that stuff, purely applicable to a master's athlete. And then I guess the other part of it is it's just consistency, and that's like any athlete. We know that I'd probably say, without getting too specific, I think 55, 60 is where you'd start to notice a little bit more of muscle atrophy, where the muscles actually are sort of decreasing a little bit. So I think that's probably where you need to be a bit more conscious of that. But if you're training consistently all year round with a periodized program that's consistent and considerate of these things,
yes,
with good recovery measures in there, I think that's probably going to be the biggest one. There's no reason as to why you can't train as hard or as similar to an elite athlete.
Yeah. What kind of recovery methods would you be recommending for a master's athlete?
Well, across the board, regardless of master or not, number one is sleep.
Yep.
Sleep is probably the biggest one. Your adaptations happen in your sleep. So everything that we do out in the pool or on the court or on the field or in the gym, and the stimulus that you create from that training session,
yes,
occurs in your sleep. It doesn't occur at that time of your training. So you need to sleep, and you need to have deep sleeps and really good sleeps so that you can actually get those recovery adaptations. So length of sleep is one, quality of sleep is two. So making sure, you've got a really sound sleeping place where there's darkness in the room, it's not too hot, there's not too much sound either. So, a lot of external noise like traffic and things like that. And then, so it's hard to do sometimes depending on where you live, but if you can create a really good sleeping environment, getting off the technology half an hour to an hour before bed so your brain's not overly stimulated, so you can get into those deeper levels of sleep earlier on.
Yeah.
Are key. And then I'd say number 2 to that would be nutrition.
Yes.
So making sure that you've got a really well looked after diet. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean you have to diet. It means you have to be getting in all your nutrients that you need, macros and micros, vitamins, proteins, all the things that you would necessarily need to recover well as fuel the body for your training. So it's not necessarily about just eating to recover, it's eating to perform and eating to train, so that you are using the correct fuel sources when you do go out and do your training sessions. This might mean that you need to see a sports nutritionist or a sports dietitian to help you structure that better. You may have some knowledge in that area you're on your own, or you may feel pretty good about how you are eating. But if you're not recovering well, then you've got to kind of find what's the missing link. So is it my sleep? If you know you're sleeping well, you can use, there's a lot of apps now that you can use. Those Whoop bands are pretty good, where you can actually track how well you're sleeping and recovering.
Yes.
And you can start to find the attributes that aren't recovering as well. So if it does come down to nutrition, things like your stretching and mobility work is also really good, just to help keep that muscle soreness away. Yeah. But I definitely say number 1, and this is one where everyone wants all the secrets, all the supplementation, pills, whatever else you want. It's sleep. Sleep is important.
Yeah. You also mentioned just before about breath work. What do you mean by that?
This is a really interesting area that I'm trying to learn a little bit more about myself at the moment. Breath work can include, like, when you're actually training or competing, is how you breathe. Obviously different for a swimming athlete because they've got very minor little points where they can actually grasp their breath. But talking about how you breathe in terms of breathing in through your nose and out through your nose, or in through your nose, out through your mouth, creates different ways that we breathe in terms of whether we're doing it through our belly, diaphragm, all that. And that's how the oxygen is actually taken in. So, and how well you use it in terms of your heart rate. So if I'm puffed out after a big effort of sprints or whatever, and I'm heavily breathing through my mouth, I'm not actually allowing the oxygen to go in and do its thing to help me lower my heart rate and level my head and all that sort of thing. So that's where that nasal breathing really helps, because it goes through the correct pathways. That's one side of things. The other side of things, it's very useful for things like recovery, through meditation, mindset and things like that. So, again, lots of apps out now that you can use to help assist through that. I'm not actually sure what the names are off the top of my head, but those apps can take you through breathing patterns to help you lower your heart rate, go through some mental calmness, and focus on that, all through using breath, because breathing regulates our heart rate.
Yeah.
And if your heart rate is up, or you're a bit anxious, or you're puffing or whatever it is, breathing is what's going to slow that down. So there's heaps of different methods that you can train breathing, but I definitely think it's an area which is something that needs to be focused on a lot more as you start to go through high levels of sport.
Yeah. I've seen on a few sort of Instagram people I follow, I've seen these little devices popping up where they're exercising. It's sort of like a whistle, I suppose, and it has restricted breathing flow through it. And I've seen people exercising with those.
Yeah, they're quite interesting. And then the other way to do it is you just pop a bit of tape across your mouth, and then it stops you breathing through your mouth, and it trains you to breathe through your nose, so you are breathing correctly and at the right rates. So yeah, all those little devices and things can be quite effective into how you do it. And then But again, the cheapest and easiest way is just tape across the mouth. And then it's definitely very interesting. You can start off by just doing it in your home and just focusing on 5 to 10 minutes worth of breath work, and slowly actually doing it with some exercise. So you might go for a walk, but put tape across your mouth. You might go for a jog once you get the hang of that. And then you might do it when you're doing something slightly a little more intense, where you're going for a run, or you're on the bike, or something that's actually getting your heart rate up while you're training. Can be really interesting to kind of see how you can handle that. It can be a little bit daunting at first when you first try it, because you're so used to breathing through your mouth, and you may not even realize how much you're breathing through your mouth when you are exercising. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's just really interesting to see how quickly your heart rate changes when you don't. One of the best examples I can think of off the top of my head at the moment is Novak Djokovic. If you watch him, when the camera focuses on him in between points when he's playing, if you just watch his routine and you just see how he controls his breathing, it's absolutely incredible, because at the moment he's probably one of the best athletes in the world. And to watch that routine every single time he plays a point, there's definitely something there that's helping him recover quickly in the 20 seconds that he's got before he plays his next point.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, as a swimmer, obviously we don't breathe through our nose in the water. So it's obviously through your mouth, because you breathe through your nose, the water goes up there. But that's really interesting to think about it on land and how that could help you in the water. I think it's something to sort of like investigate further. Definitely. Yeah,
look, I wouldn't say I've investigated it too much in how it would cross over, say, if you did practice it on land when you were doing your cardio training or your weights training, and how it would transfer across. But I would imagine that if you are more aware of how to control your breaths, it can have some form of crossover, or you're training your body to be more efficient with the breaths that it takes in. I would assume that there would be some sort of crossover there. Where I think it'd probably have a really good crossover is if you are doing team events, and you need to recover quick in between, changeovers or relays and things like that. That could be a really big benefit for it, because you are actually not in the water breathing. But the other benefits that it does have is if you are training more efficiently in your conditioning work and things like that, because you're breathing better and you are recovering better because of it, you'll have physiological adaptations that take place because you're training that way. Then in the pool, that's where you get your crossover. Maybe not necessarily in the actual breathing practices, but because you've kind of trained more efficiently through your cardiovascular systems.
Yeah,
that's where I imagine there'd be more of a crossover.
Is that similar then to altitude training? Like,
yes and no. Altitude training is an interesting one, because it became quite a big topic. Probably I'd say about 5 or 6 years ago, and people were coming out with altitude training masks that were meant to replicate those situations. I haven't done too much of it myself to actually speak to it, or in terms of actually researching too deep into it, I haven't actually gone down that path, because a lot of the research that came out later on was that it doesn't work that well in terms of getting what it was supposedly meant to be doing. I think where it does have its benefits is if you are going to be competing at a high altitude. So if I'm a skiing athlete, or if you're going to a country that is naturally at a high altitude, that's probably where it would have its benefits to acclimatize to those situations. But, and I know a lot of, I don't know if they do it anymore, but they did, like footy teams would go and trade at altitude chambers and things like that. So I think there is some work that can help. How much it helps and how beneficial it is for the time and money that it would cost to go and do, I don't know how worth it is. I have to look a little bit more into it. Yeah, there was a lot of it that got debunked, especially those altitude masks. They were big for a while, and it was like, oh, I should use this. It's going to be good for my breathing, good for my cardiovascular, all that sort of stuff. But I think those got debunked quite quickly. And then, you're always going to get something out of it. So I know a lot of footy teams use it as team bonding experiences because it is naturally going to be working harder in a high altitude. So it's like pushing each other, mindset training, all that sort of stuff can work there. If we're talking purely performance physiological adaptation, I'd say acclimatizing to those altitudes is probably where you're going to get your best benefit from it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, there's just such a wealth of information on the scientific side of sport, and it's so intriguing, and we're always still learning, aren't we?
Oh, yeah. Oh, it'll be 10 years' time, there'll be the next thing, and there's always going to be something new, but it seems to always circle back, though. Like, you're always going to have all these new fancy little things that come out, and, glute training was the big one for ages. It was, put your mini band around your legs and activate your glutes, and everything, all the other problems will go away. It just became the big thing for a long time, and now it's like, well, it's a part of it, but it's not the be all and end all like it once was claimed to be. Then it just cycles back around to the simple things work. The things that have worked for years work because they work.
Yeah, exactly. And part of that, hard work and consistency.
100%. Yeah, consistency, I'd probably say, is the number one thing that people overlook when they're trying to find the next fancy thing. It's just do the work multiple times per week, multiple times per year, 3 months, 3 years, 3 days, all that sort of stuff. Put your protocols in, and the results will show.
Yeah,
it's everyone wants the quick results, but it doesn't unfortunately happen that way all the time.
Yeah, exactly. I know earlier on when we were talking, you mentioned that pull-ups were terrific for swimmers, like not actually like specific of the stroke, but just the muscle group that you're using. You were talking to a master's athlete, a master swimmer, and you had to sort of say, here's 4 exercises that are super important for swimming, pull-up being one of them. What would be the other 3 that would go along with that?
3. Okay.
Just to put you on the spot there.
Yeah, no, it's just hard to choose so little. There's so many that are like.
Yeah, I know.
we're talking upper body specific, because swimming is so overhead in every stroke that you do. Mainly partially, maybe not breaststroke, but again, there's still overhead elements to it. I would say overhead movements would have to be key. Pull-ups being a vertical pulling motion. The reason why, to elaborate a bit more on why I like it so much, is because of how much it recruits in terms of a compound movement, with all the stability and the strengthening and the muscles that are included in that movement.
Yep.
And being from an overhead position. Whereas, say, like a lat pull down, which is very similar, doesn't require as much strength and control than a pull-up does. Whereas pull-up is full body and the body weight movement that you need to be able to pull your whole body up. Obviously, you can regress them with band-assisted and machine variations through your pull-ups. However, because of the position that you're being put in, it's a very natural position with where your shoulders have to move should your mobility allow. Whereas, say, a lat pull down, because it's a machine, depending on the machine, a lot of more modern machines are designed to make it easier to get into positions that for people that can't. So machine weights obviously definitely do have their place, but they do generally make it easier to get into a position, whereas, say, pull-ups are quite more robust in that way. So I'd add in probably a pushing motion in there, so an overhead press. And I'm going to keep that broad because there are so many variations of an overhead press, dumbbell, barbell, single arm, double arm, seated variations, standing variations, You can use your legs a little bit in some of these as well. And then rotator cuff exercises. So your internal, external rotation would be a key. So whether it's a dumbbell variation, banded variation, cable variation of your external, internal rotations. But if you're trying to pick 3 upper body movements, I would say those would be your key elements to make sure that you've got robust and high performing shoulders.
Yeah.
Obviously, our shoulders don't only move vertically, they move horizontally, they go all the way around. So things, depending on your stroke that you are in, you probably need to look at different movements. So horizontal pressing and pulling and fly variations would probably be really beneficial. But if we're only picking 3, I'd probably say those would be my 3. And then I'd have to, and I'm breaking the rules a little bit, but so lower body. For swimming, you can't go past the Chinese plank variations. So these are, for those who don't know, these are almost like a glute bridge, except your legs are relatively straight with a slight bend in the knee. These can be done just on the floor, or you can do them in between 2 boxes where you've got your shoulders and your heels on a box. Reason why is those are pretty much where your legs are going to be for the majority of the time in majority of your strokes. Yep. So those Chinese plank variations are really good for developing the hip and the hamstring strength that are required to maintain and hold those positions. Again, variations on these movements are going to be determined by your stage of development and where you are in your training. We go single leg, double leg, holds, changes, fast changes. Things like that will all depend on your training phase. And then face down variations of those, which is pretty much just in reverse, where the front of your shoulders and your toes are on the bench rather than your heels. That just requires a little bit more, core and hip stability as opposed to hamstring.
Yes.
So those are probably one of the number ones. I would definitely say if we're talking more movement based, I'd probably say a Romanian deadlift, particularly a single leg Romanian deadlift. I think I really like for swimming athletes because of how much hip is involved in swimming, and being a hip dominant exercise, it's a really good way to train those movements. And then and it is quite a hamstring dominant exercise, but again, we're talking about picking 3, so I'm going to go with that. And then
you under pressure.
I love it. I think it's great. And then definitely trunk work. So a lot of the time when we talk trunk work, we talk, people think planks or hollow holds or power off press, which is where you have like a band or a cable coming out from the side and you're pressing it at the front. So those are big anti-exercises, anti-rotation, anti-extension, anti-flexion. Great exercises to build up core stability. But I think once you've built up even your Sorensen or your lower back holds, I think are really good. So any anti-exercise is great once you build up the stability. But one key element I think that gets missed when you're talking trunk work or core work is dynamic core.
Right.
So one thinks we need a strong core, it needs to be stable. Yes. So once you've got that stable base, your core doesn't necessarily always stay stable, especially in the water. Your hips are sort of rotating up and down. Your arms are moving over your head. So your core is actually moving quite dynamically. So things like medicine ball rotation work, or if you're going to go more dynamic with like your power off presses and things like that, where you're still using core strength, but it's more movement based, can be really effective to developing performance throughout the whole body, and actually applying some of your core work that you've done. So like having that strong, stable core that you've done heaps and heaps of, which everyone's done, all their anti-rotations, all their anti-extensions, all that sort of stuff is great. But then you actually want to rotate, you actually want to extend. You need to flex your core so that you can have the ability to move effectively and efficiently and powerfully in those ways as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting. I mean, I know there's so many exercises to choose from, but I think
Mm.
it's good for our listeners to hear, just if they are not at all familiar with
Yeah.
strength and conditioning, that's, there's a few little places to start, obviously with the help of someone who can guide them. But
Yeah, definitely. I think that's obviously the key, is because there's so many variations. I mean, you would have heard me say there's so many variations of each different exercise. Knowing which variation is going to be the one to use, but also knowing why you're putting that variation in there is going to be the next layer to that. So not just doing it because it looks somewhat applicable to the sport that you're doing. You know, working, you've got to sort of look at it and think, well, okay, yeah, it is applicable, but does my athlete need this? Yeah. Or does my athlete want this? Do they want to look good doing this exercise, or do they actually need it? So there'd be heaps of exercises that I've prescribed in the past that doesn't necessarily look like a movement they do in the sport, but they need that element to fill in some sort of gap or create some sort of strength that allows me to open a door or 3 or 4 more doors that I can then walk them through to create some more opportunity for more training adaptation.
Yeah, that's great advice. Look, Ryan, thank you so much for giving us a real insight into strength and conditioning training. I think a lot of our listeners, it's an area that's sort of like not explored as much. So hopefully we've given them a good place to start. And best wishes during this lockdown period, and
thank you.
Back in the gym in the next week or so.
Yeah, seriously, can't wait to get back in there. Thank you for having me. I hope everybody got something out of it and was able to give them something to go and work on.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, take care.
All right, thank you.
Okay, bye.